was Halloween night, 2024, and I was bursting with excitement. At just 11 years old, I had spent the evening dressed as a spooky ghost, complete with a flowing white sheet and a face painted pale white with dark circles around my eyes. My friends and I had been out trick-or-treating for hours, gathering candy and sharing laughs, but as the clock neared 9:30 p.m., it was time for me to head home. My parents had set a strict curfew for the night, and I didn't want to get in trouble. As I walked back, the streetlights flickered in the crisp autumn air, illuminating the scattered leaves crunched under my feet. The neighborhood was quiet now. The laughter and chatter from earlier were replaced by an unsettling stillness. I could see a few other kids walking home in the distance, their candy bags swaying at their sides, but soon they disappeared around the corner. As I neared my house, I heard a faint sound from the street, a soft, rhythmic creaking. It was strange, and I considered turning back for a moment, but my curiosity got the better of me. I paused to listen, straining to hear over the rustling leaves. Then I saw him, a man on a bicycle, pedaling slowly in the darkness. He was shrouded in shadows, and I couldn't make out his face. My heart began to race. As he approached, I noticed a second figure standing near a tree, holding a large bag that seemed filled to the brim with candy. The sight of that bag was oddly comforting, yet something about the scene sent shivers down my spine. The man on the bike suddenly stopped and turned to me, his hood casting a dark shadow over his face. Panic washed over me, and I instinctively took a step back. Just then, the figure by the tree moved closer, and I realized it was a man, his eyes glinting in the dim light. I felt frozen, unable to move as they both stared at me. "Hey kid, want some candy?" the man by the tree called out, a wide grin spreading across his face. "No thanks," I shouted, my voice trembling. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Then in a split second, the man on the bicycle lunged toward me, grabbing my arm with a grip like iron. "You should come with us," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Help! Help!" I fought against his hold, trying to pull away, but he was too strong. Just then, a light flickered on from the house across the street. Eric, my friend who lived nearby, popped his head out the window. "Hey, what's going on?" he shouted, his eyes wide with concern. The moment he yelled, the man holding me hesitated, looking back at the streetlight that illuminated the scene. That moment of distraction was all I needed. I yanked my arm free and sprinted toward Eric's house, adrenaline fueling my legs. I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. "Eric, help me!" I gasped as I reached his front porch. He flung the door open, and I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. "What happened?" Eric asked, his voice filled with panic. "There were two men, one on a bike, and they tried to grab me," I panted, still shaking. We could see through the window as the man on the bicycle and the other man exchanged hurried words, glancing nervously at the house. Then, without warning, they turned and pedaled off into the night, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. I collapsed onto the floor, my heart racing. Eric grabbed his phone and called the police, explaining what had happened. After what felt like hours, the officers arrived, their lights flashing, cutting through the darkness. They took our statements, and I could see the concern in their eyes. "We've been receiving reports of suspicious activity in this area," one officer said. "You did the right thing by running. We'll patrol the neighborhood tonight." After they left, I stayed at Eric's house for a while, too scared to go home. We sat together, talking quietly, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As the night wore on, I learned that just days before, there had been news reports about a group of kidnappers targeting kids in the area. Eventually, my parents came to get me, and I told them everything. They were grateful I had escaped, but were also worried. Halloween had always been one of my favorite nights, but now it felt different, darker. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the fear that had settled in my chest. Halloween in 2024 will be one I'll never forget, a reminder that sometimes the darkness hides things far more terrifying than ghosts and goblins. I learned that being cautious and listening to my instincts could be the difference between safety and danger. And as I drifted off to sleep, I promised myself I'd never let my guard down again. The following day, I woke up feeling groggy and anxious. The events of Halloween still weighed heavily on my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the air. I decided to stay home from school, too shaken to face my classmates and their carefree chatter about costumes and candy. As I sat at the kitchen table, picking at my breakfast, my mom walked in, holding the newspaper. "Did you see this?" she asked, her voice serious. I looked up to see her holding the front page, where a headline screamed, "Two suspects arrested after kidnapping attempt." My heart raced as I read the article detailing how the two men I encountered had been caught just blocks away from my neighborhood. They had tried to lure another child with candy and had been apprehended by the police thanks to a quick-thinking neighbor who had called 911. Tears of relief and fear filled my eyes as I realized how close I had come to becoming a victim myself. My mom hugged me tightly, whispering reassurances, but the image of those men haunted me. I felt grateful they were caught, but terrified of how easily they had slipped through my fingers the night before. Later that day, I received a message from Eric asking if I wanted to meet up. I agreed, feeling a little stronger with a friend by my side. We met at the park, which was usually filled with laughter and joy, but today it felt strangely quiet. "I can't believe what happened," Eric said, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I'm just glad you're okay." "Me too," I replied, still shaken. "What if I hadn't escaped?" "We need to be more careful from now on," Eric said firmly. "We can't let fear take over our lives, but we also need to stay smart." As we talked, I realized that while Halloween night had changed everything for me, I couldn't let it dictate my future. I promised myself I would be more cautious, but I wouldn't let fear rule my life. Halloween had taught me a valuable lesson about trust and safety, and I was determined to hold on to that lesson as I moved forward. With my heart a little lighter, we decided to walk home together, knowing that even in the face of darkness, friendship and vigilance could light the way. Our city house had been home for years, but everything changed when the landlord told us we had to leave. It was sudden and stressful, but my family didn't have much choice. With nowhere else to go, we decided to move to our old family farmhouse in the countryside. It had belonged to my grandfather, but after he passed away, we'd left it untouched, visiting only for the occasional summer weekend. Now it would be our full-time home. The day we moved was exhausting, and night had already fallen by the time we finally reached the farmhouse. The drive up the long, winding road felt endless in the dark. We could barely make out the silhouette of the old house, standing like a shadow against the sky, surrounded by fields and trees that stretched into the darkness. As we pulled up, the headlights cast eerie shapes across the yard, and the farmhouse seemed to loom over us as if watching our arrival. Getting out of the car, I felt an odd chill despite the warmth of the summer night. The air around the farmhouse felt heavy, almost as if it was holding its breath. I shivered and glanced over at Ethan, my little brother, who was staring up at the house with wide eyes. "This place is kind of creepy at night," he whispered. "Come on, it's just a house," I replied, trying to sound brave, but even I felt the weight of the shadows around us. We grabbed our bags and went inside. The house was pitch black, and the only light came from my dad's flashlight as he let us in. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air, and every step we took seemed to echo through the empty rooms. I felt a strange sense of intrusion, as if we were disturbing something that had been waiting in silence for a long time. My parents tried to brush it off, opening windows to let in the night air, but it only seemed to make the darkness feel thicker. As we set up our things, I noticed little details about the house that I'd never paid attention to before, the way the floors creaked just a little too loud, the shadows that seemed to pool in the corners, and the feeling that we weren't quite alone. That night, sleep didn't come easily. We all tried to settle into our rooms, but the farmhouse was alive with sounds. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft groans of the wood and the occasional thump that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house. Just as I was about to drift off, Ethan came running into my room, wide-eyed and breathing fast. "I heard something." he whispered, clutching his flashlight. "In the hallway, like someone walking." I told him it was probably just the wind, but deep down, I felt a chill. The house was old, and it could have been anything, but it felt like more than that. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences continued. We'd hear faint tapping sounds on the walls at night, even though there were no trees nearby that could have caused it. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. My parents tried to brush it off, saying it was just our imaginations, but I could tell they were starting to get unsettled too. Then one evening, something happened that changed everything. We were all sitting in the living room, talking about plans for fixing up the farmhouse, when we heard a loud banging noise from upstairs. It sounded like someone slamming a door. My dad got up, flashlight in hand, and went to investigate. We followed him nervously, staying close together. When we reached the top of the stairs, we found the source of the noise, a small locked storage room at the end of the hall. The door was closed tight, but it had never been locked before. My dad frowned, muttering about how he didn't remember locking it. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Just as he was about to force it open, we heard footsteps, soft, deliberate footsteps coming from inside the room. Ethan gasped and grabbed my arm. "Someone's in there," he whispered, his voice trembling. My dad took a step back, his face pale. "There can't be," he said, but even he looked uncertain. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was thick and heavy. Finally, my dad decided to leave it for the night, hoping it was just an animal or some odd noise from the old pipes. The next day, however, we got a surprise visit from one of the locals, our neighbor, Mr. Grayson. He was an older man with a stern face and a gruff voice. He didn't seem happy to see us there, eyeing us suspiciously as he spoke. "Didn't expect anyone to come back to this old place," he muttered, glancing up at the farmhouse. "Strange things happen here, you know. People say this house, it's not just empty." My mom raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Mr. Grayson shrugged, but he looked uncomfortable. "Strange noises, shadows moving where they shouldn't. The kind of things that make you feel like you're not alone." He looked at Ethan and me. "Kids like you shouldn't be here. This house, it has secrets." With that, he left, leaving us feeling unsettled. My dad tried to shake it off, saying Mr. Grayson was just a superstitious old man. But that night, the sounds returned, louder than ever. It was as if something or someone was pacing the halls, moving from room to room. Just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, Mr. Grayson showed up at our door again, this time with the police. He claimed he'd heard screams coming from our farmhouse, saying he thought something terrible was happening inside. We were confused, as we hadn't made any noise at all, but Mr. Grayson insisted, demanding that the police search our house. The officers were polite, but they had to investigate. They looked around each room, finding nothing out of the ordinary. But when they went to check the barn, they discovered something unexpected. Hidden in the old hay were items from Mr. Grayson's house. An old mirror, a photo of his family, and even a few personal belongings that looked like they'd been left there on purpose. The police turned to Mr. Grayson, their faces filled with suspicion. "Mr. Grayson, why are your belongings here in this barn?" He looked shocked, then stammered, saying he had no idea how they'd gotten there. But the officers didn't buy it. It turned out Mr. Grayson had been sneaking into our property, planting these things to make it seem like our house was haunted, hoping to scare us away. They arrested him for trespassing, and as they led him away, he kept muttering warnings about the house, saying it was cursed and that we shouldn't stay. But from that night on, the strange noises and footsteps stopped. It was as if the only real ghost in the farmhouse had been Mr. Grayson's twisted plans to frighten us. The farmhouse finally felt like home, and though I sometimes still feel a chill in the air, I know it's just the memory of that eerie time, when a haunted house turned out to be haunted only by someone's jealousy and secrets. Halloween 2024 was supposed to be our biggest night yet. My friend Luke and I were looking for the ultimate scare, something that would leave the haunted houses in town feeling tame. We'd heard about the old cornfield on the edge of town, abandoned for years, with rumors of strange happenings every October. People claimed they'd seen figures moving among the stalks, heard whispering voices, and even footsteps following them out. Most of it sounded like Halloween hype, but to us, it sounded perfect. We waited until after dark, grabbed flashlights, and drove out, armed with Luke's old camcorder, to record our adventure. The road was empty, and as we left town, streetlights disappeared, leaving just the narrow beam of the car's headlights cutting through the darkness. When we parked, the cornfield stretched out in front of us like a black ocean, with rows of tall, swaying corn fading into the night. Luke grinned, adjusting his flashlight. "This is going to be epic. Ready?" I nodded, though I felt a chill. Stepping into the field felt like walking into another world. The corn was tall and thick and seemed to press in on us, blocking out all light except for the pale moon overhead. The only sound was the gentle rustle of corn in the wind and the soft crunch of our footsteps. About 10 minutes in, we found an old scarecrow hanging on a broken post, slouched like it was tired of standing guard. The burlap face was torn, its single-button eye staring blankly into the field. Luke tapped it and joked, "This is probably the scariest thing here." But as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following us. A low crunch of footsteps echoed behind us, and every time we stopped, the sound stopped too. Luke dismissed it, saying it was probably just animals moving in the night. Then as we walked deeper into the field, Luke suddenly stopped, aiming his flashlight toward the sound. "Wait, did you see that?" I turned, catching a glimpse of something slipping through the rows just out of the light, a shadow moving too fluidly to be an animal. But it was gone in an instant. My stomach twisted. We continued walking, quicker now, hoping it was just a trick of the night. Then came the sound of footsteps again, only louder, crunching through the field just a few rows behind us. Luke lifted the camcorder, filming the rows as we walked. In the small viewfinder, I saw the corn swaying, the shadows stretching, and then a shape, tall and dark, slipped across the screen. It was too fast to make out any details, but it was enough to know we weren't alone. The footsteps got closer, now deliberate, like someone was stepping just close enough to let us know they were there. Luke looked pale, his usual grin gone. "Let's just keep moving. Maybe it's someone playing a prank." But then, just ahead of us, a figure stepped into our path, blocking the way. The flashlight revealed a figure wearing a torn burlap sack over its head, the rough fabric molded into the shape of a face, with empty eyes cut out, staring at us through hollow holes. Its clothes were tattered, and in its hand it held a long, rusted scythe. The sight was enough to make my blood run cold. We didn't speak. We just turned and ran, taking any turn we could, not caring where we went. Behind us, the footsteps followed, each step louder, closer, crashing through the corn. It was fast, faster than any person had a right to be, and every time I looked back, I saw it, closer and closer. After what felt like hours of running blindly, we burst out of the field and stumbled onto the dirt road, gasping for breath. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The cornfield stood silent as if nothing had happened, the tall stalks swaying gently under the night sky. We scrambled into the car and drove away, our hearts racing, not speaking until we were miles down the road. Halloween 2024 had brought us the ultimate scare, but not the kind we'd ever wanted. And sometimes when I think about that night, I wonder if that figure is still out there, hidden among the corn, waiting for the next group to wander too far into its field.